So I will maybe quickly introduce our lovely moderator of this day. So Hayat is a passionate evaluator from Jordan with over 15 years of experience in monitoring and evaluation. She's enthusiastic about learning and observing the impact of evaluation in our daily lives. A former co-lead and current member of the EVALSDG Guidance Group and currently co-chair of the AEA Systems in Evaluation, TIG. So hey, Hayat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lenka, and hello again, everyone. It's really a privilege to be here with you all, and I'm so thrilled to be with you and to have the chance to moderate the session. On behalf of EVALSDGs Guidance Group, I would like to thank all the attendees, the moderators, and the speakers that are with us here today. And very quick, maybe housekeeping notes, if everyone can just mute yourself. So to have the avoid any noise that is there. So as mentioned, this yeah, and maybe Lenka, you can also help us with meeting people. Yeah, and as said, the webinar is recorded. We would love to have this session as interactive as possible, so we encourage you all to interact in the chat. Maybe at the very beginning, you could just introduce yourself, your name, your role, and where you are from in the chat so that we get to know you. And feel free to add your questions along the way. So, and we'll make sure to have them to address as many questions as we can in the questions and answer in the Q&A session part. Next, Lenka. And just as said, here's where you can mute yourself if you are connecting from computer or from mobile. There is the mic icon. If you click on it, just to make sure that we can hear our panelists and speakers. So next, Lenka. And with that said, I just want to just give you an introduction about today's webinar. So as a guidance group for EVALSDGs network, we are organizing, we are developing what is called knowledge products that are our insights, evaluation insights, a very brief knowledge product with a specific topic on evaluation and how it is related to a specific goal from the Sustainable Development Goals. Recently, our speakers for today, Scott Chablu and Joy Mukoma, has authored a very nice insight on transformative evaluation and transformative change, and they will be introducing this insight for you today. And afterwards, we are having a panelist discussion with our great panelists that I will introduce when we come to that point. They will share their great insight with us. They will try to focus on their specific aspect of that insight and to highlight it from their experience. And of course, I don't want to, and we'll have a part for the questions and answers where we'll try to address your questions and to dig deeper into specific aspects of the insight. And our Scott, our colleague, and who is already helping us since very long time with volunteering as well with us in our different insight, will be also providing a synthesis at the very end. I don't want to miss thanking all our colleagues, the volunteers that are with us today, or they might not be here, but also they are taking an important role with EVALSDGs Guidance Group, helping us launching different insights, preparing different dialogues. So thanks for them, and thanks for our executive committee who are supporting us as we with all the work that we are doing. And to have it to start now with the first part of this enriching, hopefully, dialogue, I will just ask Joy and Scott to start with their presentation. And if they allow me, I'll just provide you with some introduction about our two colleagues, the members of the EVALSDGs network. Joyce Mukoma is a young and emerging evaluator from Kenya. She currently works as a monitoring and evaluation consultant at UNITAR. She has co-authored the insight that she will be speaking today about it with Scott. Scott is an evaluation and strategy specialist with over 30 years experience working with civic, public, and private organizations, seeking sustainable solutions for social and environmental challenges. trained as a geographer. His work stresses complex system analysis at the intersection of evaluation, sustainable development, and transformational change. And they don't. And there's also our co-editor who's absent today. I'm sorry. So you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Hyatt. Good to be here. I hope everyone can hear me. Looking at Jalenke, if you can give me, yeah, I got a head nod there. Good. So this is the first page of the insight note that Joy and I co-authored, and it's an introduction, and it summarizes some key themes at this intersection of evaluation and the transformational agenda, and it's also a bit of a resource note in the sense that it hyperlinks a variety of supporting open access publications for people. What we're going to do now is I'm going to briefly take you through some key points, looking at what we mean by transformational change and some of the key considerations with that. And then I'm going to hand it off to Joy, who will follow up on that to help frame the mini presentations that we'll get from the panelists today. So in evaluation, evaluators generally like to be clear about their object of evaluation, and in this case, the concept of transformation. And I think it's important, firstly, to remember that transformation is a human concept, and there's no one definition of transformation or transformational change. And what's considered a transformation will often depend on who's interpreting it. In our publication, Joy and I offer a definition from the Transformational Change Learning Partnership, which is with the Climate Investment Funds, who Neha is here with us and will be speaking a bit about later on, which we feel is an exemplary definition that ticks the key elements found in other definitions. And that definition is a deep and fundamental change in a system's form, function, or process. Some people say if you need to ask if a transformational change has happened, then it might not have happened because you'll know it. It's a huge shift in mindsets, paradigms, and the systems that we operate in. Transformational change can be positive or negative, and I like to point that out. And this can change over time, the interpretation of what's positive and negative. And as I mentioned earlier, depending on the stakeholder group, how it's interpreted, whether it's positive or negative. For example, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa was a transformational change that was positive for society, but it had negative consequences from those who benefited from the racial segregation and discrimination that was change. Another, I think, instructive example of a negative ecological transformational change is the ozone hole over the South Pole, which was identified in the 1980s, which triggered a positive social transformational change. And that was the landmark Montreal Protocol, which was the first international agreement signed by every country in the world to regulate the production and consumption of man-made ozone depleting substances, ODS. And by 2019, the ozone hole had reduced in size to the smallest on record up to that date. That's a brief summary of what transformational change is. Another example, for example, can be the Green Revolution, which is transformational in that the introduction of hybrid crops and chemical inputs for growing radically increased the yield of food production. Positive transformation, but a negative transformation resulting from that was the pollution of groundwater and topsoil, and often dependency on these external chemical inputs for growing foods. Okay, moving on. What I want to talk about now briefly is three interrelated drivers of the transformational agenda in the field of evaluation. And the first is the urgency of today's global systems challenges. I think people are aware if the science points to a near-term collapse scenario if society doesn't address some of the fundamental challenges regarding climate change and environmental degradation, and basically shift from a business as usual scenario. Recently, the Global Tipping Points report, which came out late last year, pointed out that humanity is currently on a disastrous trajectory. An international team of more than 200 scientists found 5 major tipping systems already at risk. And this will have catastrophic consequences, not just environmentally, but socially. They're very much interrelated, which is an underlying premise of transformational change work, and that is the interconnections between natural and human phenomena. And hence, people might have heard often the term the Anthropocene age. And that's the age where humans themselves are basically the major cause of change or destruction on the planet. And that's what we're confronting with in this century. So that's a first driver. A second driver, and these drivers are all interrelated, is the increasing attention and recognition and uptake of complex systems analysis. Given the complexity of the challenges that we're confronting, there's been more emphasis and acknowledgement that these challenges and any solutions are integrally interdependent and interconnected. And this in itself is a transformational change in how development is being pursued. And that's the third driver, is when this gets institutionalized, for example, in the 2030 agenda, which is the largest framework in the world for international development. With that, the development industry and evaluation coalesces around this concept of transformation. And you get webinars like this, you get publications on it, you get people looking for ways to measure and assess the degree to which interventions that claim to be designed and affecting transformational change, are they really doing it? Okay, so those are the 3 drivers. Now what I'd like to briefly talk about are 3 interrelated boxes that confine or restrict evaluation's transformational potential. And I'd like to talk about them because they're really the kernel to the solution as well. They point towards the types of changes that need to be addressed if evaluation is to be part of the solution and contribute to transformational change versus reinforcing business as usual evaluation. And by that, I don't just mean evaluation of what's happened, but ex ante evaluation or diagnostic evaluation plays a critical role in designing what people would like to do to affect transformational change. So the first box, the project box, is evaluation that supports accountability. Evaluation should support accountability to the planet rather than discrete interventions or projects. Measurement and evaluation assessment should not be consigned strictly to desired results, predetermined results in their KPIs, but it should be open to unanticipated consequences, whether it's positive and negative, on human and natural ecosystems. The second box, the temporal box, basically reality doesn't conform to project budgets and timelines. We need more iterative monitoring as evaluation to support course correction and adaptive management, rather than just the conventional baseline, midterm, and final evaluation approach. So we need to consider this more actively as evaluation supports projects and programs and other intervention strategy. And also consider the evaluation of long-term impacts on the larger human and natural ecosystem. Ex post evaluation is getting increasing attention. The third box that I would like to speak briefly to is what I call the quantitative box, or tongue-in-cheek, it's sometimes called obsessive measurement disorder. Measurement and quantitative data is critical for evaluation. It's invaluable. But an obsessive measurement disorder occurs when the production of quantitative data undermines the very interventions it's supposed to support. It's often asserted what gets measured gets done, but another witticism worth repeating is not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And then the third box, and again, I realize I'm being brief on this, is the accountability fixation, which kind of fuels the other boxes. I recently just wrote a piece called Obsessive Accountability Disorder, OAD, just last month. But this occurs when evaluation becomes so fixated on accountability that it becomes a descriptive tick box accounting exercise, fixated on whether something is done right versus whether the right thing is being done in the first place. Historian Jerry Mueller, who published a book with Princeton University Press called The Tyranny of Metrics, observes that the most characteristic feature of the metric fixation is the aspiration to replace judgment based on experience with standardized measurement. So I will maybe, once I'm not sharing my screen, try to put in the chat a link to an article called Evaluating Outside the Box, which is an open access article on Social Innovations Journal that takes a deeper dive into these boxes. But for now, I just wanted to, and of course, our insight note with Eval SDGs also does that. But we just wanted to give you kind of a little taster menu of some of that for the time being. And I want to hand it off now to Joy, who's going to speak with you about some ways to move forward in evaluation and transformational change work. Joy?
Thank you, Scott. So just quickly following up on what Scott has mentioned, we highlighted 6 key pathways which essentially answer how does evaluation transform to better support the transformational imperative. And so I will quickly brush through them in the essence of time, but we do invite you to dig further into the links we shared in the insight, just so you can get a better understanding of these pathways. So we'll start off with the principle-focused evaluation. Ideally, even in our daily lives, we have principles that guide our actions and behaviors. And it's the same for evaluation. For example, from the Blue Marble evaluation, they are guided by principles. And here they note that to deal with the complexities of global issues and problems, we need principles to guide us, not a rule book to tie us down. And therefore, these principles are there essentially to direct us to view the world holistically and systematically and allow us to examine the interconnections of problems and solutions. So for Blue Marble evaluation, they identified these principles, 4 overarching principles, which provide the big picture. They essentially act as the goals, and 12 operating principles, which provide a more specific guidance, acting as objectives. And a fun fact maybe is that this infographic that you see here, we developed it with Scott, and Blue Marble actually picked it up and added it to their website. So it was really an exciting experience to develop that infographic. Next slide, please. A second pathway is the complexity adaptive methods. So in this case, we are stating that by incorporating these complexity responsive or adaptive methods, we as evaluators can better navigate the intricacies of complex systems to address global challenges. And there are several methods that we can identify, for example, developmental evaluation, where we adjust the evaluation design and methods as the program evolves, as well as systems thinking, where we can analyze the interactions among components in a system. So these complexity adaptive methods are integrated to allow us to respond to these complex and chaotic scenarios that we are currently experiencing in the world. Next slide, please. So a third pathway is the data science technology. And here we are simply asking ourselves, how can we use data, given the advent of the startup technologies right now? How are we using this data to understand the complex systems? For example, with the use of artificial intelligence, how can we use it to better inform evaluation, to leverage transformational change? And you've already seen there's some, but in the previous slide, you can see that there are some insights that were already developed that touch on this big data. Eval Insight 8 and 9, they speak on how we can strengthen evaluation using this data, as well as the challenges that face the use of this data. So we also invite you to look further into that, the previous insights. Next slide, please. Okay, we have transformational evaluation criteria. As we have noted, the OECD DAC criteria that has been previously developed has been deemed inadequate in some degree to address transformational change. So what we need at this present time is a criterion to address these complex systems and leverage transformational change. And an example is this micro-queen patterns criteria. He identifies 6 criteria which support system-wide assessment. And we also have the TCLP's 5 dimensions of transformational change, but I will not get deeper into that because my colleagues are going to discuss that in the panel. And next slide, please. Okay, as they're moving on to the next slide, we also have the alternative perspectives and paradigms as an alternative pathway towards, yes, thank you, and paradigm in evaluation. So here we look at the different perspectives that have been channeled towards how we can look at evaluation through the lens of transformational change. For example, the knowledge construction from indigenous communities, traditionally marginalized populations, as well as how young and emerging evaluators are using new lenses to evaluate from the angle of transformational change, as well as decolonizing evaluation, where we're questioning all this, the influence of power in our evaluation models. Next slide, please. And fine, okay. As we move on to the next slide, we finally have futures thinking, also known as foresight methods. Here, we are looking at how we can explore, anticipate, and plan for the future. So this goes beyond traditional forecasting by considering a range of possible futures and identifying emerging uncertainties as well as emerging trends. So the goal here is to develop a deeper understanding of future possibilities to make informed decisions in the present. I think my colleague will also discuss this later in the panel. So for now, I hand it back to Hyatt. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Joy, and thanks, Scott, for this comprehensive introduction and building on what our colleagues has just introduced, we'd like to welcome our esteemed panelists who will be exploring the insights within the recently introduced insight. I will just provide a brief bio about each of our panelists by the order of their presentation. Neha Sharma leads the Evaluation and Learning Unit of the Climate Investment Funds. She has over 15 years of experience in climate, environment, and economic and social development, with expertise in evaluation methods, result measurement, and learning. In the past, Neha worked on evaluation at the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank and the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. Candice Markel, Dr. Candice is the Director of CLEAR Anglophone Africa. She has 25 years experience in government, academia, and the nonprofit sector, specializing in M&E and public policy. She currently works with government and development partners across the African continent to help build and strengthen national evaluation systems. Oscar Garcia is the Chief Impact Officer at the Global Energy Alliance for People and the Planet. He was the Director of Independent Evaluation at UNDP and Director of Independent Evaluation at IFAD. He was chair of UNEC, comprising 50+ evaluation units in the UN system, and chair of the Evaluation Cooperation Group of International Financial Institutions. And Zenda Ofer, Dr. Zenda is a South African strategy and evaluation specialist working from Geneva. She specializes in understanding how intentional change can be designed, executed, and assessed to increase the chance of sustained positive societal, systematic, and transformative impact trajectories amid uncertain futures. A former AFRIA president, IOCE and IDS vice president, AEA board member, and lead steward in the SDG Transformational Forum. She designs, evaluates, and advises in many sectors and organizations around the world. Also, Joy, our colleague, will be joining the panelists as well. So I'll move it over to hear the rich experience from our panelists. I'll start with Neha. Please go ahead, Neha.
Thank you so much, Hayat, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very important conversations. It's really a pleasure, especially looking around the room and seeing so many colleagues that I hold in such high regard and respect. So thank you for having me here. I'll start by briefly introducing the Climate Investment Funds and the work we're doing through the Transformational Change Learning Partnership. So many of you here are part of the Transformational Change Learning Partnership, or the TCLP, so I'll see if I can give you a shout out as I speak. But first, what is the Climate Investment Funds? The Climate Investment Funds, or the CIF, is one of the largest multilateral climate funds in the world. We have over 400 projects in over 70 countries with committed resources of 12 billion, and we're working across the adaptation and mitigation domains. And when CIF was created, which was in 2008, so many years ago, the climate negotiations were faltering and we were seeing only incremental progress. So the G7 at the time got together to create a fund that would channel resources into developing countries for both adaptation and mitigation. And it was really set up to do things differently. And the phrase transformational change is in the original mandate of the climate investment funds. However, at the time, there was no definition or framework or colleagues getting together to understand how exactly CIF would attain transformational change. So the intention was there, but the tracking and the monitoring and evaluation frameworks were not. So in 2016, when the CIF was in the thick of implementation, a lot of the resources had been committed and projects were functioning, is when we created the Transformational Change Learning Partnership to bring together colleagues to define transformational change for the purposes of climate, for the purposes of the CIF, build a whole framework around it with dimensions to understand how we would track it, to understand how we would assess whether transformational change was occurring in our portfolio, and not do this alone at the CIF, but do it through a partnership of like-minded colleagues or colleagues who were struggling with the same complexity challenges that we were. So that's how the TCLP came to be. Since then, we've had over 700 colleagues become part of the TCLP. We've had a lot of different agencies adapt the work that we're doing and help us build it together for the purposes of the CIF. I see here in the workshop today, we have Tim Larson, Nasiba Chimor, and Andrew here, who are part of the Ross strategic team that are lead facilitators for the TCLP. Scott, Candice, Zenda, Oscar are part of the TCLP. And I'm, of course, representing the work of a big team led by Mike Ward in the Climate Investment Funds. Mike is attending a CIF programming call while I'm here to speak with you. So I just wanted to start by introducing the SIF, introducing the TCLP to you, and hopefully I'll have an opportunity to speak about what this framework is, what the dimensions are. And one of the things that I'm keenly interested in, and Scott and Joy, you did a great job of opening up this conversation and introducing us to some of the constraints in the system that we're trying to address through working on transformational change. But one of the things that I'm very interested in is how to apply these ideas into the SIF portfolio and into the work that we're all doing. Because as we know, if we're trying to not be obsessed with accountability, not be obsessed with short-term and project boundaries and some of the things that Scott, your very nice slide brought up, it's really difficult to do in practice. So we're experimenting with a few ways to do this in the SIF, and I'm hoping for an opportunity to speak about that today.
Thank you so much, Neha. Yeah, thanks a lot. This is very interesting. And I will now call for Candice to share her thoughts. And then just a reminder that, and I think we are fine with time, that every speaker, if we can make it to 2-3 minutes, that would be great.
Thank you so much. And also let me echo Neha's gratefulness at being invited to this space. I think that there's really an illustrious panel of speakers here, and many of whom I'm blessed to call friends and colleagues. So thank you so much for inviting me here. I want to take a slightly different angle to transforming evaluation and talk about transforming national evaluation systems. And, I've got a picture of an iceberg over here, and, there are some of these things that manifest in our evaluation system. And we talk about what is wrong with our current evaluation systems. When I talk about systems, I'm talking about those institutional parts that supply and demand evaluation. So not necessarily talking about from a system science perspective. And the work that ClearAA does works with governments in establishing these institutional mechanisms to provide evaluation for evidence use. Some of these problems that we see manifesting are producing more and more evaluation with little impact. We look at poor evaluation use. There's a huge reliance on international evaluators rather than local experts, context poor evaluation, mistrust of evaluators and evaluation in general, and then duplication and misalignment of evaluation efforts. I'm sure many of you are aware of these kinds of problems. The stuff below the iceberg that I want to talk about in national evaluation systems is the fact that we have an outdated, extractive, accountability-focused system, and some of that came out of what Neha and Joy and Scott mentioned, with little or no downward accountability or learning. And that is ensconced in the kind of development systems that we've had out of colonial bureaucratic systems, especially after development on the African continent. These systems of, bureaucratic systems were really extractive, and evaluation or machine-based, should I say, not extractive, and then evaluation became extractive because it's all about upward accountability. So evaluation at the moment, these manifest problems, it's a deeper rooted problem around how development is defined and how evaluation is then subservient to that definition. It's moving a little bit fast, but just one point on the previous slide is there is poor or no recognition of local or country-based national evaluation systems or local ownership in development cooperation. So that's another kind of, root cause of some of the manifestations of the problems that's wrong or what is wrong with our current national evaluation systems. So I want to focus on what we can possibly do, or where should we be focusing our attention in transformation. One of these is to actually recognize that evaluation has the potential to harm and to reproduce harmful patterns of development practice, and to understand the history of evaluation. That the altruism of evaluation is not necessarily what always comes through or manifests when evaluation is done. And we need to adopt an intentional approach to transforming evaluation, and it includes decolonizing evaluation systems and practice. We need to also acknowledge and formally build in the value of evaluation beyond accountability. So looking at learning, at programmatic improvements, at great understanding of how a program works. So even in the national evaluation systems that we support or help build, in the countries that we work, sometimes they are so ensconced in an rhetoric that it's really difficult for these systems to actually acknowledge and formally build in this learning component. And I think there's a transformational shift that's needed there. I think what's also important is to acknowledge that there is a mimicking of what already exists, and we need to value new social ecological models of designing and institutionalizing evaluation systems. What I mean by that is my earlier point that development, particularly in the global south and on the African continent in particular, especially in post-independent democratic states, had very hierarchical, rules-based, machines-based systems, bureaucratic systems. And these systems they don't lend themselves to a social ecological way of thinking and designing another part of the system, which is evaluation practice. So when evaluation practice is introduced into these bureaucratic systems, they are then machine-based, rules-based, hierarchical. And we need to think about new social ecological models of designing and institutionalizing evaluation systems. Because if we produce the evidence from these bureaucratic machine-based systems, the evidence is going to be upward accountability. The evidence is going to be an obsession with measurement, quantitative measurement, an obsession with accountability, and all of the manifestations we've spoken about. And lastly, I think it's really important to recognize that there are local and locally owned national evaluation systems. So in development cooperation in particular, EVALNet did actually a study last year on country partnership and the posturing of country ownership of evaluation systems. And it found it wanting in development cooperation. There isn't really a recognition of these national evaluation systems. And I think that there needs to be an alignment of development cooperation and broadly evaluation systems to national evaluation systems, which are born out of an endogenous and locally developed plans, national developed plans, and so forth. And there needs to be a commitment to strengthening this local ownership and these locally led evaluation systems in development cooperation in particular. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Candice. And I can see that from your part and from Neha's part, there is a lot more information that I can see that the attendees are eager to hear, and hopefully we can cover as much as we can in the Q&A. So I'll move it over now to Oscar to share your insights on the topic.
Thank you very much, Hayat. I hope you can hear me well. I'm really delighted to participate in this webinar with so distinguished panelists and colleagues of the evaluation field around the globe. I am working now at the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet as a Chief Impact Officer. And as such, let me zoom into one of the challenges of our time, which is actually that the global transition towards renewable energy, in our view, is one of the defining challenges of our time. We consider the decade ahead as the window of opportunity to preventing a climate catastrophe. Therefore, investing in renewable energy, we think is one of the most effective ways to address the issue of climate change. And you may have seen that there is a growing interest in renewables. There is an increased emphasis on investing in renewable energy. However, all the headlines that you may see on the newspapers are hindering a reality that this investment is trickling down to developing countries way too slowly. And therefore, a transformative approach is required to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all, which is actually the SDG number 7. Allow me to share with you a few data points to illustrate the magnitude of this problem. Limiting global warming to the 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold set under the Paris Agreement will require a huge reduction in current CO2 emission from current levels and annual deployment of around 1,000 gigawatts of renewable power, which is more than triple the amount deployed in 2022. Achieving that target, purely from a connectivity point of view, would require 100 million new connections a year. That is 4 times the projected level for 2023. Just to continue with a few figures, in sub-Saharan Africa, over 30 countries will need to connect more than 5% of their populations annually to reach this goal and really avoid a climate catastrophe. When we speak about modern consumption of energy, in the developed world, nowadays the use is over 9,000 kilowatt hours per capita on average. However, over 3 billion people that live in developing countries, the consumption is below the energy minimum threshold of 1,000 kilowatt hour, compatible with a sustained human development threshold. Therefore, we are seeing really that perception of risk, scale, the governance environment, and other barriers to investment all are hindering a green transition. And so are capital costs. The International Energy Agency estimates that the capital for renewable energy projects in Africa costs 2 to 3 times as much more than in rich countries in China. Therefore, sub-Saharan Africa, with 1/5 of the world's population and some of its most abundant renewable energy resources, attracts less than 2% of the global renewable investment. So that's the justification and the sense of urgency of why we need a transformative approach. GIA is an alliance of many partners, more than 50 partners, really working to accelerate the transition towards renewable energy. And its distinct competencies and advantages is that it wants to accelerate the uptake of renewable energies with a strong focus on equity and efficiency. We are deploying 2 main technologies. One is distributed renewable energy, and the other one is battery energy storage systems. And we see those as scalable solutions for a number of priority countries where we have demonstrative effect to delivering results. These countries are very difficult environments to operate for renewable energy. However, if we get it right in those countries, the multiplying effect is really manifold. Our resources are modest in relation to the financing requirements of the countries we work in, but if we use them judiciously to support innovation and risk sharing between public and private investors, our capital can drive change. But this is where the transformative approach to change comes so handy. And therefore, we have developed an approach in which we think that our investments need to be relevant, but need to bring change at scale and speed while addressing systemic issues that are unlocking or blocking actually the flow of investments in these countries for accelerating the transition towards renewable energies. In addition to identifying those criteria, which were really emanated from the CIF and the Transformative Change Learning Partnership, and we are a proud member of the network, we have also illustrated the importance of understanding S-curves. S-curves as a figurative representation of the time taken for technological innovations to achieve wide distribution. And the concept of S-curves tell us about also that the progress and progression that we want to see is not linear. It really has the shape of an S, in which we want to see a series of stages moving from initial adoption through the emergence of a market characterized by rising demand and more widespread dispersion to a surge in investment and subsequent leveling off. And therefore, we think that our alliance is uniquely placed to catalyze this change. And we are applying this transformative change to evaluation to assess the relevance of every investment that we make so that it would be really transformational and bring the desired change to the lives of people who are not accessing not just a sustainable, but modern renewable energy across the globe. I would be very happy to respond to any questions that you may have, but this was just an illustration of its application in a real case example for an organization committed to address the climate catastrophe that we are about to face. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oscar, for taking us into that illustration, into that journey. And I now will move it over to Zinda.
Thank you, and thanks to Scott and Joy for this a very good contribution and opportunity. So from my side, simply a few issues that I want to put on the table that I believe has to have our attention. Number one, we need to ensure that the interest in evaluation for transformation continues, and we need to avoid transformation washing. Eventually, that will be to our detriment. So, of course, we need to help expose transformation washing. In 2022, we did a study among some of the most experienced evaluation professionals, and even among them, working towards systems transformation felt to them somewhat overwhelming, and some even doubted its value. And of course, the aid-driven development, project-based nature of much of our work is a real barrier to change in our evaluation space towards transformation or supporting transformation. But it is evolving in a positive direction. We can see it in conferences, in webinars, in articles, and in many organizations that are trying to apply complexity concepts and systems thinking to evaluation and using evaluation for that purpose. So financial allocations to this type of work is still lagging. But it is very important that we continue to gain momentum in our capacities and in the contributions that we make. It's essential if evaluation as practice wants to remain relevant for this time, especially as the aid industry recedes, as it is doing and will continue to do. We must also just stop calling things transformative and evaluating them as transformative when they are not. And maybe we can return to this during question time. A second point I want to mention is that evaluation has to get, and evaluators have to get out of our comfort zones. About 5 years ago, I went out of the evaluation space and joined quite a few initiatives that were working on transformation. And I was working with specialists in transformation who had no idea or very little idea of evaluation and its value. This was a huge learning for me and very useful. They were working in areas like ecological civilization, economic and financial system transformation, circular economies, and so on, right? There are many, many of these networks of people trying to make, to transform systems, usually at a global level, but sometimes it's on a regional or bioregional level. And so these are spaces that we need to get far more engaged with. And here I also want to highlight, when I talk about spaces that we need to get engaged with, also the Global South. We as evaluators from the Global South needs to become far more assertive and also innovative and knowledgeable about the frameworks and the ways of working that have already proven to be great successes in the Global South where it develops. But we can further expand our knowledge about this and get away from the focus on decolonization and so on as process, and look at the framings and additional, the theories and also additional ways in which we can conceptualize transformation and transformation practice and support it through evaluation. Now, we need to establish or become part of what is called a transformation system. A transformation system is people from all disciplines and walks of life trying to catalyze transformation with a particular vision in mind. So they work not necessarily together, but they work towards a common vision of how a system or set of systems can transform, or a certain situation or sector or part of the world. And perhaps we can come back to this as well. A third point, we need to shift from obsessing about impact and measuring impact to evaluating or facilitating the assessment and design and implementation of policy strategies and programs that are aimed at transformation. This is to be done appropriately early on and continue. And some of the elements that are very important in doing this is looking at design. So the point is, if you design and implement in a way that enhances the chance of transformation, you may not always be able to figure out the impact, but the chance of transformation will be much greater. So with this, one can, of course, and we have all said of this, but just some examples. One can see whether people follow a portfolio rather than a project approach. One can see how well transformation principles, and including complexity concepts especially, are applied. These are fundamental. And if people in future evaluators do not understand how to work with complexity concepts, it's unlikely that you will be able to be good evaluators. It is going to be an essential need to capacity to develop. Also, in a design, one can look at how well a society's history, culture, and disposition to change have been considered in content and in processes. Importantly, one can consider whether there's sufficient focus on the patterns in a system that hold problems in place and make change hard. These barriers to change usually relate to the purpose of a system, and to the policies, practices, the resources, the relationships, the power, and the mindsets that make the system what it is. Last year, I worked with the MasterCard Foundation, and I saw Minay Pabari is on this call. I worked with her. She made a major contribution in working in this space, making sure that programs are designed to reflect the patterns that determine what the system is, and that also act as barriers, and how one can remove and change the patterns to something that is far more positive. And we still, of course, need to understand better, not to develop, but how to use notions of rubrics and signals to measure progress towards systems change and transformation. And TCLP and others have done great work in this, but actually making that work in practice remains a good challenge. My final point, Joy referred to this, but I want to make an additional point in this context. We need to be better at future-proofing our findings and recommendations. We need to have a vision of what a systemic transformation would look like in future. But we also need to understand that we need, when we do our evaluations and we do our recommendations, especially our findings and recommendations, we need to shift from linear projections into that base what goes on in the future into on past and present situations, to being much more savvy about possible futures. It means not only, of course, using foresight and so on, but being very considerate of the global and continental shifts, the trends, the global risks that will influence the future from global to local level. That means working with trajectories and with different possible futures within which we then can locate our recommendations. Only then will our findings and our recommendations really make sense. So these are some of the things that I've been focusing on and also have been learning that are really crucial when we try to apply the very nice principles and the very nice concepts in transformation. When making them work in practice is not a simple matter. Back to you, to our moderator.
Thank you so much for sharing these points, Santa. And last but not least, I will ask Joy to zoom in when aspects of the insights. Joy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hayat. So if I have my slides, well, it's okay. Well, just to echo in on to most of what has already been mentioned, there is a key aspect on decolonization, which I had mentioned as an alternative perspective or paradigm towards evaluation. And it briefly touches on what most of my colleagues have already spoken about at this point. Approaching decolonization on my end as a young and emerging evaluator from the Global South, where I or we continuously have to ask, how do Western ideologies dominate our systems, dominate evaluation? And how can we devise new frameworks that will allow us to be forward-thinking, as Zenda has mentioned, to look into the future and come up with solutions that address these complexities that arise? This is noting that most of our systems have been dominated by power, which are ingrained in the West, because most of these systems were formed during the colonial period. And noting that even our development enterprise, how we conduct aid, how we go about incorporating these interventions, they remain highly influenced by Western perspectives and interests, and they operate within these neo-colonial frameworks. So during these unprecedented times, which we continue to mention, we are experiencing a lot of negative shifts in our environmental systems, our social systems, our politics, our economies. So we need systems that respond to this chaos that continue to emerge. We don't need something that is business as usual, as Scott had mentioned. And so for evaluation, we need to first acknowledge in its end, as you will see in the next slide, that power dynamics do exist in evaluation. And as evaluators, we need to be conscious of our positioning and biases so that we can respond to these injustices that continue to occur and be able to still allow evaluation to steer transformational change. As we're doing this, we then realize that transforming evaluation rather, is in itself decolonization, because as evaluators, we consistently ask ourselves several questions. Whose expressions of power can be observed in evaluation? Who holds the power? Who doesn't? And whose values continue to dominate? And how do issues of power inform the evaluation design and processes? So as we continue reflecting on such questions, they allow us to have or develop diverse approaches to knowledge construction amongst ourselves as evaluators, between evaluators and stakeholders. So doing this allows us to reconsider evaluation practices and priorities. And looking at this quickly is that there are several ways that have been researched on how we can actually decolonize evaluation, I'll quickly brief on just 4 steps that have been researched on, but this does not just confine them to these 4. There are others that continue to emerge as we go about transforming the evaluation system. And the first one is that we need to decolonize evaluation and evaluators. In this case, we need to already admit that evaluation is in itself colonized. Then and only then can we be ready to devise new methods, new models that will allow us to develop new knowledge that responds to the current complex contents. For example, as we've already seen, there is new criteria that's being developed that we can already look at. The second step is that we need to critically evaluate existing models. In this case, the current models are highly dominated from the North. And if I can mention that even the new methods that are being introduced, the articles that are being written on evaluation, they're mainly from, well, most or some are from authors from the North. But we also need to consider some of these new models that are written or being propagated by developers and evaluators from the South, and understanding how can we best channel this new knowledge that is being constructed and be innovative with it so that we can easily allow evaluation to readily contribute to transformational change. And the next step is that we need to conduct research into country-specific evaluation models and traditional approaches. There already exists a lot of indigenous ways of knowing, which respond to the culture, the history, the people, because we need to factor in these values as we conduct evaluation. And once we do this, then we can easily develop systems, country-specific decolonized evaluation models. So these are some of just some steps that have been developed and that we are using as we go about conducting or pushing forward the agenda on decolonizing evaluation. And I would like to also just leave it at us asking ourselves, as we transform evaluation, or for example, as we go about decolonizing evaluation, can we decolonize evaluation without decolonizing the structures that we're operating? As for example, Scott had mentioned, there's the issue of accountability that's really focused on right now. You have your project and your funder needs you to follow the outcome output and remain accountable. So how can we change these systems? How can we transform evaluation as we also transform the structures that we are working in? Thank you. I hand it over to Hyatt.
Thanks a lot, Joy. And I can see that there are a lot of important questions raised by the panelists, and I hope that we'll have this part at the end so that Scott can summarize all these rich points. And now to transition into the question and answer session, just a quick note on our approach. We'll try to address questions that were shared by the audience. We also have prepared some questions as a in order to help delve deeper into specific aspects from our side. So we'll try to make a balance between the two, and feel free to interact in the chat to what you are hearing from our panelists. So Jelenka, would you like to read one question from the chat?
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. So a first question from the chat is from Laura. And it's a question to Scott, actually, but I think that everyone might be able to answer this question. So she wanted to pick up on the point of good judgment and how it cannot always be measured. So how can we help decision makers develop and use good judgment going beyond evidence? Is that an evaluation thing to do, or is that a role that we should take?
Thank you, Jelenka. And in order to be able to cover as much questions as we can, I would suggest that we ask two panelists to answer this question. And so we'll just have two for each question. Anyone interested in this question from our panelists? Yes, Neha.
Giving a pause to see if those more intelligent than me wanted to have a go, but I do think it's a really, really good question, and it's multi-leveled because it's good judgment for whom as well. They're hidden. So because as evaluators, we know there are trade-offs that we make, and who is asking the question and who is answering is an important part of the judgment that we are then making. So one way we're trying to address, first of all, it's a rhetorical question, I hope. I do think it is a role of evaluators to seek good judgment in our programming. How we do this, I think, is by making evaluation a critical part of the entire program cycle. And we've heard that from almost all of the speakers that have spoken. That's not just summative evaluations or evaluations happening in the end that are important, but it's evaluative thinking and evaluative diagnostic work that's important to make our programs transformational or even effective in their own internal purposes. So we're approaching evaluation as providing good judgment through the evidence and through the data and through the lessons from past experience that are brought in from evaluative thinking and evaluative research into programming, but also making evaluation an instrument of change. So the evaluation process itself has to provide a role model for good judgment. And what I'm trying to say through this is the evaluation process needs to be very inclusive, with a focus on participatory evaluation, with a focus of reaching those who will be impacted by the programming as part of the evaluation process. Practically speaking, this means evaluation has a role in designing programs, in raising the gaps and challenges, in understanding what evidence exists to make sure that the program design is relevant, coherent, efficient, and all the different dimensions that we think are important. Evaluation has a role to play when in the CIF context, when we're selecting our countries and selecting our projects. So in the CIF context, we have the transformational evaluation criteria as part of the selection process for new countries and programs, and as part of the tracking during the implementation of programs and projects. So there again, the role is to use diagnostic evaluation work focused on transformational change to surface the gaps and challenges and to provide solutions to this in an inclusive participatory way. And then of course, there's a more traditional role of evaluation, such as the midterm evaluations and summative evaluations, and then a huge focus on learning at each of these phases to make sure that the learning from these inclusive participatory processes is then fed into the decisions that are being made. This all sounds very complicated, but it plays out over a decade. So when we look at climate interventions, they're quite long. And there are many moments where this type of evaluative diagnostic work can play a role. And I think the important part here is to make sure that those who will be impacted the most are part of the process. We just heard a really good presentation from Joy on decolonizing evaluation, and I think making that participatory approach is key, is a key instrument to making sure that we're doing that.
Thank you so much, Neha. I think you are providing tips and tools on how transformative action can be part, how can evaluation be part of a transformative action and transformative work. If anyone else would like to add to this question, just let me know. I can move to another one, and which is, so I cannot just so I can't see everyone from the panelists. So just let me know if you want to add. There's a related question that is from Mark. So what are the current pain points or challenges within the existing system or process? And speaking about the role of evaluation, it's important to look at the challenges and barriers that evaluation face in transformative imperative. Anyone would like to speak about that?
I will take that because it seems to be addressed to me. And I am not sure if Mark spoke about pain points in systems in general or in the evaluation system specifically. But I think one can talk generally across any system. Well, first of all, it is really important that we understand what the system is, of course. So seeing the system and understanding what it contains and consists of is important. When it comes to pain points, every system has probably very specific barriers or pain points, right, where there are real challenges in moving things, making a difference. And both in the evaluation system and in other systems, experiments and experience and also theory has proven that there are especially 6 things, maybe 7, around which there are usually blockages, there are usually challenges. And together with Mina in the MasterCard Foundation, we have worked extensively with these. And you can read this up. I'll place the link in the chat after this. The 6 conditions of systems change. It says, and just think about it, because I'm sure you will easily recognize this. Usually, problems in a system comes from a lack of proper policy, a lack of resources flowing in the right directions, and a lack of or improper practices. A lack of, or what is needed is a shift in relationships within the system, within power, where power sits in the system, and in mindsets. And most importantly, one needs to shift the purpose of the system if you want systems change, if you want real transformation. So a system needs to be imagined, not just let's be more inclusive or let's do more of the same thing. That's not transformation. Transformation is when you reimagine a system to have a very different purpose to what it has, right? So those 7 things that I mentioned have been identified as common pain points. Of course, they play out differently in each area that one may work in, but a huge number of barriers to change can be found among this. And we have found that almost everywhere, including in the foundation where we work, power is the most underestimated and most under, it's the one that's least often targeted for change in effective ways, right? That's a very crucial pain point. Let me stop there. No, maybe let me just also say that of the people I think who've done the most interesting work, where you can think is about pain points and about the 6 conditions of systems change. I will put that paper in the chat, but also work of somebody like Sandra Waddock I'll put a link to her most recent book as well. I worked with her. She's wonderful. And she really does address a lot of issues around transformation. Finally, if we want to change the evaluation system, we need to look at these 7 issues that I just mentioned and see what needs to change when we think about each of those. And then we can maybe have a redesigned evaluation system. Back to you, Heid.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And touching on the system change and the transformation and change, it's good to look maybe also if anyone else would like to highlight the differences between the two, or to add to any of these questions in terms of the various challenges. Candice,
yes,
yes, go ahead.
Well, so I really like what Zenda's mentioned about those 7 or 6 pain points, because it relates very strongly to the work that we do in public administration, in government-led evaluation systems. And there was actually a question in the chat as well, that what do we mean by locally led evaluation systems? And I want to link that to the fact that there is an ignorance about the fact that governments are really leading their own national evaluation systems and doing really a lot to build capacity within those systems. But there's a bifurcation between those systems and the ones that are donor-led or, led by development cooperation. So when we talk in these kind of international development, when we're thinking about the evaluation systems, because most of us work in this world, we're thinking about the fact that there's terms of reference for evaluations, and an international evaluator gets appointed, and it's either centralized or a decentralized evaluation. We go to the country, we collect the data, the findings are then channeled upwards for upward accountability. So there's this separate or parallel systems. There's that system, but there's also a lot of work being driven by and local ownership by government-led systems, where, and VOPIs, for example, voluntary organizations for professional evaluation, will understand this very well, because they work very closely with those who are trying to strengthen these systems. And what we find is that the pain point is that these national evaluation systems are actually ignored in the whole discourse around what an evaluation system is. It's seen as being, not having sufficient capacity. It's being seen as lesser than, the more sophisticated evaluation systems, and needing to be helped to get to a certain level that it will never attain, because it's just subservient to that asymmetrical power relation between the giver of development aid and the receiver of development aid. So I think the shift that we need to see happening there in those pain points is that, I'm going to make it very practical. For example, when we have evaluation steering committees, for example, why is it that we believe that the beneficiaries of a program or a service are not allowed to, or the evaluant, they're not allowed to be part of the evaluation steering committee? That comes from that upward accountability, accountability, strict machine-based kind of idea that it must be clinically separate from any kind of, influence from the receivers of the development intervention. So at those microcosms of that, those kind of changes can see bigger changes happening in the system. But there needs to be a reimagining that those systems of the local country-owned systems are as important as, the donor-led or, the evaluation systems from development cooperation. And those systems need to align to the locally owned systems. And there needs to be an alignment of the vision and the agenda of those evaluations. Because at the moment, you've got, curated evaluations from locally owned processes, but then you've got other external evaluations, and the two never meet. Thanks.
Thank you for the addition, Candice. Thank you for your feedback. I'm not sure if we still have Oscar. Maybe we have lost him. So hopefully he's connecting again. Joy, I also cannot see you. So if you would like to add to the points that were mentioned before, just feel free to jump in. And meanwhile, Ayelinka, maybe you can.
Yes, so maybe I
here.
can add. Yeah. Maybe I can pose another question from the chat. We actually here have another question on financial allocation. So given, this is from NICB, I hope I pronounce your name correctly. So given the relevance of evaluation on financial allocation, what are your thoughts on the balance on principles or signals versus hard indicators on evaluation frameworks?
Thanks, Jelinka. Anyone from the panelists would like to take this question?
Neha, you want to take a swing at this, given I know that you're familiar with signals and the challenges of attribution versus contribution analysis and trajectories and such.
Thanks, Scott. Nasibe, was it you who posed this, who's really helped us develop the framework that I'm going to speak about? So Nasibe could be answering her own question here too. But what we've tried to do, I agree, there is, so when we think about transformational change, when you think about systems and complexity, what happens is, and we've experienced this time and again in a lot of our evaluations, is a lot of the nuances come out and context becomes extremely pertinent, more than it would in a more traditional evaluation, because now what might be transformational in one context may not be transformational in another, or what may be progress in one context may not be progress in another. Because of that, the way we've approached evaluation within the SIF context or the climate context is to say that while you need some benchmarks and a baseline, and you need some things that you're tracking over a period of time, not only to satisfy the donors, which is definitely one of the objectives here in tracking something more quantitative, but also just to be able to assess something and be able to understand whether you're moving closer to the targets you set out in the beginning or not. However, setting up standardized indicators across all programs and projects just seems a superficial approach to assessing impact. So what we've done in the SIF is to create signals, early, intermediate, and advanced signals of change. And we give guidance per sector in which our program works. So there's sectoral signal guidance. And there's an assessment of whether we're moving from early signals to advanced signals over a period of time. So suppose we're trying to mainstream resilience in government institutions. An early signal may be the creation of a body that is now responsible for the mainstreaming. An advanced signal will be budget allocation to each of the different line ministries to actually incorporate resilience into their actions. And that is the type of tracking that needs to get done. I mean, you can imagine it is not possible for any one donor or any one trustee or any one agent in this system to be able to do that, because you really need to understand the context. And hence you're forced to, in a very, and I'm using force not in a negative connotation, but a very positive one, building on what Candace was saying, to really engage with local agents. And it has to be a locally led process because of what it demands, because it demands an understanding of the context and change over time. So that's sort of that has been our approach to the signals, and getting a little bit away from the indicators, though they do exist. But we only have 4 standardized indicators across our portfolio. And we have integrated results frameworks looking at both the monitoring and evaluation side. But the evaluation approach is founded on approach of signals and progress of signals over time versus indicators.
I wonder if I can add to the great contribution that Neha has just made, but I'll come at it also from another angle. May I?
Sure.
So, and it's because I'm actually keen to make this point more generally, because it cuts across much of what we are doing in our discussion. There is a huge need to shift dominant narratives or core narratives about how the world works, right? And just an example of dominant narratives, you know, neoliberalism that destroyed many countries in the global south. The dominant narrative there was the private sector knows what to do, just open your markets and the competition will be good, right? That was a very dominant narrative, and everybody bought into this, to the destruction of many economies in the global south. We have a dominant narrative, human rights is more important than society's rights, right? And that's a dominant narrative because it's imprinted in our mind. It's not an absolute truth. But when people want to promote a particular way of doing and being, they create a narrative that changes mindsets. And so what we in evaluation needs to try to do, those of us who believe that we need to move further and get more money into transformative evaluation or evaluation for transformation, is to create a narrative that is more dominant than, let's say, applying the DAC criteria and checking impacts, right, with indicators or something along, sorry for the simplification, right? So we, and also organizations who work with impact, they need to create impact narratives that are convincing, right? So one of our biggest challenges is to create new narratives that then become dominant, that are different to the truisms that we believe today without questioning why we believe them, right? And that will help us also in evaluation. If we can identify what are the main narratives that make evaluation what it is that may not be justified in the context in which we work today, that would be something very useful to consider towards change.
Thank you so much, Sanda. And I will ask Joy if she has, I saw her videos, I see her video. So if you want to add anything, Joy, to the questions that were under the comments. Joy, you are on mute.
Yeah, I think you can hear me now. I think it's just to echo what Zenda had mentioned before regarding these policy challenges that we face as we conduct evaluation, because that's one of the main things that I have encountered as I've gone about conducting evaluations, because evaluation has been turned into a private good, which is something that has followed the waves of these policies and following this new liberal and evidence-based waves of evaluation. And so for it to restore itself as a public good character, then it must break these chains of the market-based governance model. And it's something that we need to really steer at this point, ensure that it is being used in a way that serves its purpose in ensuring that it leverages transformational change and it's not used as a weapon, because in itself, evaluation can be a weapon. And so new policy directions are required at this point for each to make evaluation more country specific. Then new policy directions is something that needs to be addressed. And it's one of the biggest challenges now, because most governments are not taking it as a public good. So that's something that I just really wanted to emphasize at this point going forward. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you so much, Joy. And it's a lot of important and rich information shared by the panelists. And I can see also that we have a couple of questions in the chat, but maybe to help us summarize all the rich points that were shared today, I'll ask Scott to provide a synthesis or a summary of what was said and to share his feedback on the panelist contributions. Please go ahead, Scott.
Thank you. I'll start off with the last thing first, the feedback. I want to thank the panelists for terrific presentations and some engaging thoughts on the topic. With regards to summarizing everything that's been said, being a complex, adaptive thinker, I'm going to duck out of that. I don't know if that's possible, but I will try to give some concluding remarks. And one of them that I want to point out is that how shall I put it? The understanding of transformational change and the transformational agenda has really advanced in the last decade. If you go back to 2015 or before that, and you look at where we were at and where we are now, there's been quite a lot of changes in how people understand it. And I think probably most significant is, for me, a most significant example of that is the recent UN Global Sustainable Development Report, which focuses on accelerating transformations for sustainable development. And in 2019, it identified 4 levers of change: governance, economy and finance, science and technology, and individual and collective action. When the report came out last September, right before the COP, the decision was made to add capacity building as the 5th lever. And I think that's really important for us to remember, because to a certain degree, that's what part of this webinar is about, is building the capacity for people who practice evaluation, or people who support evaluation, and then people who affect evaluation, to better understand a more transformationally supportive approach to evaluation. There was another observation that was interesting to encounter in the report. Again, it just came out, back in September, was they made the point that transformation is inevitable. It's going to be happening. So if you can put yourself on mute, that'd be great. What's important for us to think is the degree to which evaluation can help steer that transformation to be positive and supportive. Some of the other reflections that came to mind on the presentations is the importance of institutionalizing transformational change when we can do that. For example, SIF has 9 monitoring, evaluation, and learning principles, and one of them is inclusive transformational change. I've recently worked also with the Adaptation Fund. One of their 7 evaluation principles is complexity sensitive and adaptive. Okay, these aren't magic bullets, but when you start making these changes in the organizational DNA, it can start affecting how people pursue evaluation and use it to support the assessment and also the design of their intervention. Another thing that came across is the importance of partnerships. I think Oscar's presentation and experience with the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, I know from SIF's experience with TCLP, the challenges that we confront globally, these transformational challenges, if you want to call it that, are not going to be tackled and addressed unilaterally. They need to be addressed collaboratively, and that's something that Zenda also spoke to as well. And then there are the points that Joy and I felt Candace raised, that an important part of this is, and this is a fundamental bedrock of complex systems analysis, is engaging multiple perspectives. And that's particularly the perspectives of those stakeholders that might be traditionally marginalized or excluded from the evaluation process. Hence the attention on decolonizing evaluation and the localization of evaluation. I also would like to say that, predicting systems change that's inherent in transformational change is inherently challenging. But there's one certain thing that we can predict, and that systems will change. So when Zenda raised the point of futures thinking or foresight analysis, I think that's really critically important for us to remember that our theories of change are scenarios. That's a future foresight exercise. And it's important for us to also look at alternative futures. For example, if Trump were to get elected, game changer. We had a pandemic, game changer. We've had 2 wars break out in the last, just over a year, game changers. So it's very important for me. It's not so much just the transformational change, but the complex systems analysis lens that we as community evaluators use to look at the interventions that we're trying to support. I know we're at time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Hyatt And just want to thank everybody with the EVAL SDG teams again on my behalf for all your support. Hayat?
Thank you so much, Scott. It was it's really a very rich discussion, and your contribution is also very important. It raises a lot of questions. All the panelists' contribution were they really need an additional webinar. I'm hoping that everyone is enjoying the webinar. I would like to thank you, Scott and Joy, for co-authoring this insight and for speaking in this webinar. I would like also to thank Zinda, Neha, Candice, Oscar for being with us today and sharing their rich experience. All our team, our volunteers from EVAL SDGs Guidance Group, Irenka, Lenora, Roxana, Aisha, and whoever all our colleagues that helped with putting this webinar together, and our executive team who are supporting us in all our work. We look forward to having you join us. If you are interested in co-authoring or co-leading or co-editing another insight, please feel free to reach out to us. I just shared the website for EVAL SDGs in the chat. I also would like to thank the co-editor, Rob, who could not be able to join us today for some personal reason, Rob Vandenberg, for his contribution to put this insight together. Thanks again. We wish to see you in future webinars, and yeah, thanks everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. Great session. Thank you.